Well, what's going on, guys? Evan the MTG Enthusiast here, bringing you an MTG gameplay commentary. And this time I want to talk a little bit about some different experiences I've had in Commander. And I'm hoping I can kind of springboard this into some more focused topics. So think of this like a warm-up upload just to introduce this idea of my thoughts on Commander and maybe taking questions in the comments, and I'll maybe do some responsive things like that. Definitely meant to be the most conversational and the least agenda oriented type discussion. And who knows, maybe I'll luck out and some of my friends or folks on the internets will want to jump on a group call here and have a chat about these things. I think that would be fun. Like everybody else, I want a podcast. I just don't want a podcast. I just want to put it on YouTube because I'm a boomer. Okay, anyway, bad jokes aside. So I've got here a little list on Mox Field of some different things that I want to talk about that I have some experience playing against or playing, and often cases a little bit of both. And I want to talk about my feelings and what they lead me to believe about the typical Commander player. So I do not sit at CDH tables. I sit at more of the weird Rule Zero cusp of how good is your deck really, which I actually think is kind of an impossible conversation. And so I really think we as a community should have this conversation about what does it even mean to Rule Zero, and how feasible is it to have these in-depth Rule Zero conversations that are productive and meaningful. Yeah, so let's go through one topic at a time. So in terms of things I kind of want to introduce here, a lot of this are things that people have strong reactions to. I have, give or take, 5 examples of each of what people have really strong reactions to. And this is not a 5-color list, it's just a 5-color pile. So I can talk about different cards. So we're just going to move left to right here, or rather right to left. And starting here on the right-hand side, we have extra turn spells. People do not enjoy playing against extra turn spells. I think they get a bad rap. I definitely play them in a luge, which I think is the optimal way to play a luge, and the list is here on Moxfield if you want to take a look at it. But I think the reason people dislike playing against extra turns is by nature of what's going on, it'll make that player's turn take a lot longer, right? Because they're going to double the length of time they're playing. And I think these get a bad rap because it's usually a piloting issue more than a card strength issue for the most part. And so you've got things like Capture of Jingzhou, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, where you take an extra turn after this one. You've got Nexus of Fate, where you take an extra turn after this one. This card, of course, was controversial when it was printed, because at the time, the only way to get it was a box topper. I believe that's since been remedied with additional printings. Yeah, like the list and core, so Secret Later Drop, much better. Time Stretch, take 2 extra turns, but it's a lot of mana. Time Warp, once again. So I want to talk about those 4 first. The issue with this tends to be the player who's playing their deck likely has plenty of intricate things to think through and do, and they probably haven't practiced the deck as much as everyone else at the table would like them have practiced before they played this, which is fair. I mean, you have to get over the board or on the internet practice to really understand your deck, and people tend to swap out decks a lot, for a variety, for the table's experience and for their own experience. And as a result, you don't become really practiced. Whereas if you're playing in the quote-unquote competitive commander community, you probably do play your competitive list like all the time, right? Because you've probably tricked it out. You're taking it to tournaments. You want to know it inside and out. This isn't a entirely social experience for you, and so you know how to play your turns quickly and efficiently. Often, folks will play these cards, and then their extra turn takes 7 to 8 minutes on top of their regular turn. And I will admit, there's probably nothing more like toxifying than watching the player who has a bunch of extra turn effects insist on playing on their phone over everybody else's turn. And then when it gets to their turn, they haven't really mapped out what they're going to be doing. You really wish they'd taken the time to think through what they're going to be doing. But I think that, once again, that isn't just an extra turns related problem. I think that folks in general in Commander games spend a lot of time looking at their phones, doing other things, and not focusing on the board state, what's going on. There's a lot of cards on the board, so it can be overwhelming and overstimulating to even try to kind of read all the cards at the table. So I think sometimes folks just focus on their own thing and they'll sort out the rest when the turn comes back around. And I think depending on how much focus you're giving versus how long your turns are taking, it's pretty understandable. But With these extra turns, I think players get understandably really infuriated when you haven't been planning out your next couple turns, when you knew and you know you're planning to take extra turns. It's like, respect the table's time. Please pay attention. Please be ready to take your turns. That said, sometimes even if folks are playing complete attention, if you've got 8 or 9 interactive permanents on the board and you're taking an extra turn, these can just take a while to play through. And it's kind of the nature of the beast. And so I guess my out loud thinking on this would be we need to respect the fact that when folks are playing a lot of extra turns, encouraging them to take reasonably fast turns isn't rude, particularly if your social skills are up to par and you can politely suggest, like, please take a game action, right? That's the thing you hear a lot, I think, when you play 60-card Magic, which I really miss a lot, was 60-card competitive Magic that actually had a following and judges and things like that before Commander was the premier format. And slow play was a real consideration. It was a real problem. Slow play's always been a problem in Magic, but it wasn't so kind of widely frowned upon. Just look at somebody and be like, hey, please take a game action. I don't need you to think through your entire turn, but I do need you to be moving here. I've never sat at a table that's so slow we need like a chess clock, but there's definitely some element of like, let's keep it moving, please. And when a player that tends to just be guilty of slow play and being easily distractible is playing extra turn spells, that's bad news bears. I do want to do a special carve out here for Expropriate. Expropriate is a really powerful extra turn spell. Now, it's 9 mana, so it ending the game is pretty common, but a resolved Expropriate can be a little bit maddening because it has a lot of sort of combined effects, cumulative effects that really agitate the table. I think cards like Council's Dilemma, while fascinating from a social perspective, can be really unfun to play against, which I'll walk through a little bit later. But depending on the votes here, this person might be taking like 4 or 5, or not 4 or 5, but at max, 4 extra turns. But at a minimum, they're probably going to take 1 extra turn and gain 3 permanents they're not necessarily super familiar with, or 2 turns and 2 permanents, and it's just going to take a while. A lot of the time, I'm an advocate for if they resolve Expropriate, just offer the concession and see if the table agrees. Which I think is another big problem in Magic, is people's unwillingness to concede games. So I'm all about slugging it out to the end, particularly if you have outs and you think you can get there. But if the misery that's going to be inflicted on you is too great, or it's going to make you salty, and after they play it out, you're going to be really agitated that you sat there and waited, just offer the scoop. And I think that that's a completely reasonable thing to do. So if you're not sitting at these ultra competitive tables, I don't know why folks are so kind of resistant to discussing a concession across the table. Now, if you can't get the full table to concede, you might just have to accept it's a social game and wait it out. But I don't know, I'm pretty quick to offer a concede if somebody's got an Expropriate. Okay, let's start at the bottom here. So Stax. I love Stax. I used to play Stax on Legacy. I think Stax are an integral part of Magic, and I don't know why they get this bad rap that they do. I have a friend who uses the expression pretty frequently, like the anti-gamer, right? They play the game, but they are miserable, and they want other people to be miserable, and that's kind of the internalized vision of a Stax player. And I think that's absolute crap. Stacks are a pretty intricate list to play. You tend to have a lot of things that work together to make the stacks work. You tend to have cards that work in tandem to break the parity of stacks. That way you can sort of get around the stacks. And so starting here with probably one of the the classics is Stasis, right? So players skip their untap steps, including lands, of course. And so no one can untap anything. And so folks will spend a long time just holding lands in their hand, trying to build up enough lands to tap and hit an answer to Stasis. But the Stasis deck itself is probably more intricate than folks are giving it credit for. Because folks probably, if they want to do a build around on Stasis, need a way to tutor Stasis, either in the command zone or in the 99. They need a way to break the parity on Stasis, otherwise they're not going to be able to pay the upkeep. That might require playing some suboptimal lands or playing an expensive piece to untap the lands. Playing cards like Wilderness Reclamation or Seedborn Muse, which Seedborn Muse actually won't work, I don't believe, because no one has an untapped step, so bad example. But once again, things to break the parity on this. Urza, so you can keep capping artifacts and then having methods to untap it. I think these cards, I think Stasis in particular, is sort of a build-around that I don't think is easily just slotted into any deck, right? There are a ton of cards in Commander that are really, really good that you can just put into any deck, and it'll probably make the deck better, or at least it won't make it worse. And that's something we can talk about here. Look at some other cards on this list. So I think that folks need to kind of look within and realize that preventing people from doing the thing that they want to do with their deck is an important element of a dynamic game of Magic. I don't know why it started to be considered rude to not just play decks that aren't just designed to like everyone at the table will do their thing and we'll see whose thing was the best. I think that overemphasizes kind of this like put green in my commander's colors or put some sort of crazy treasure generation, which that's another topic I've got strong feelings on, and just go crazy and go to the moon and be as greedy as possible with my list. I think that's bad deck design, and I think it's deck design you would only even explore in Commander. And that used to be more charming than it is today, right? Like back in maybe like 2007 to 2011, which is when I can speak from personal experience, when Commander was not the primary format for Magic. Most players were familiar with Commander, but only played it as kind of an aside, right? I'm kind of bored with my 60 card table, kind of bored with 1v1. I want to do something weird, a little bit different. So I went through my binder and made this pile, and this is my Commander deck, and it's a pile, and it's kind of an expression of both of what I own and what I think is fun. That was great. I thought it was fun. Now, when most of the printed cards, I think, are Commander facing, aren't outright designed for Commander, and so many cards are completely not viable in Commander. I don't know. It's different, right? I think we're in a different era where this whole idea of everyone gets to play go tall, do whatever you want Commander is silly. And this idea that people can't play Stax or can't put the brakes on these cars is how you get your Chernobyl-style nuclear reactor decks where you've removed the brakes from the car and let's just keep going until we go critical and just destroy everything. Just everything being your opponents in this kind of ham-fisted analogy. But I think it's worth thinking about, like, how much better would your games be if folks were actually slowed down a little bit in a meaningful way? Like, not just I put random Stax cards in my deck because I can't build decks, but I put Stax cards in my deck because I intend to break the parity on them. Stasis, once again, is a great example of, like, you can concede. Like, if somebody has a stasis lock on the table and they reliably have their engine going, they're going to be able to break parity, they're always going to be able to pay the upkeep, and they're actually getting further ahead with each passing turn. I think it's time to ask the table to concede. Like, does anyone have any reasonable way to remove this stasis or this engine in the next 4 or 5 turns, next 2 turns? You can even ask the stasis player, are you willing to reveal protection out of your hand? Because if you can reveal protection, we probably can't break the lock and you can just take the game. And I think that's an easy way to get out of stasis lock is, can we break it? No, concede. And the weird thing with this is I would rather prefer if when that was the case, the players playing stasis wouldn't have to kind of feel bad and kind of feel sheepish and switch to their worst deck against the other player's best decks to pad the feelings a little bit. Like, there's no shame in playing Stax or stasis. And I'd be interested to hear if somebody can make a compelling case for why there's a problem with cards like this, but there's not a problem with cards like, I don't know, like Consecrated Sphinx, or there's not a problem with cards that, if unanswered, are undeniably going to result in you winning the game. Because it seems odd to me that it's kind of against the social rules to play cards that prevent other people from doing things, but it's completely fair for you to do things that, if they don't engage with it, you just win the game. I think it's worth thinking about. I think there's other big content creators, or I'm not big. There's other real content creators that have this idea of, let's stop like hammering on Stax players for being bad, and I'm really on that bandwagon. I'd like to make some Stax decks. They're not really at the forefront of my deck building, but I enjoy playing against Stax decks because working to dismantle the Stax is also a really intricate process at times, and it's a lot of fun. I think we should destigmatize. Oops. So Smokestack. I put Smokestack on the list because I think it's one of the poster children for the Stax experience. And I bring it up because I have a personal sort of anecdotal story here. So I used to play, in my first sort of commander deck I sleeved up was a Doretti, the original Doretti, right? Goblin Pope. And the whole premise was to basically play some weird mix of like 4 or 5 Stax cards to try to slow down the game and reanimate some big artifacts. The deck was terrible. It overwhelmingly lost games. It couldn't reliably assemble the Stax pieces. It couldn't reliably combo out. It was basically like a janky pile. And it still made folks angry, which I thought was really entertaining because even when the Stax are bad, people find them really annoying. And then I started to think through, is that because I had the table Stax locked and I couldn't win? Or is it because I had the table Stax locked and it just stacks as Stax? So I started asking people the question, and I would either get dishonest responses like, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with Stax." I'm like, "Yeah, except the fact you're clearly super pissed," which happened pretty frequently. Where like you'll ask a Magic player, like, "You all right?" And they'll be like, "Yeah, I'm fine." When they're not, they're pissed off. Like it's in my experience, Magic players and human beings aren't that good at hiding how they feel. And there's no shame in saying you're pissed, but like, wow. This is like this card is very polarizing, right? And so I think it's not just a matter of strength, right? Because anytime you play Stax card, even if your deck is bad, you tend to get some annoyance, which has led to this piece. Like it's just because the Stax decks can't win. But even if the Stax deck can't win, like in the case of the Duretti thing, like I was in a position where they can't break the Stax lock from Smokestack, plus some other things. I'm building up counters on the Duretti, so eventually I'm going to get the Duretti emblem. I'm going to win. Smokestack will eventually be unremovable at that point, coupled with all these artifacts I'm playing. So I know you can't visualize this board state right now, but I'm in a position where I have inevitability. It's just not as flashy as this is my combo and you all die. It's this is my inevitability. Does anyone have any way to react or engage with this? No. Okay, why don't you all concede? No. Okay. You sit there, grind it down for 20 minutes. People are like, that wasn't very fun. I was like, what to tell you? Like, ew. So please destigmatize Stacks. Continuing though, you've got some stacks that I think are maybe rightly more agitating. I'm fine with all stacks cards, but I will say like cards like Opposition Agent, well, they're very good, and I enjoy Op Agent a lot. I think Op Agent is interesting. These are universally good cards. They may not be the best universal use in your space, but cards like Stasis and Smokestack, to a certain point, you have to put cards in your deck to make them not just outright dead or mostly useless draws. Whereas Opposition Agent, people are always going to be searching their libraries, be it for lands or for specific things. So I can see why Op Agent, for example, is a little bit more salt-inducing, because you've got players that just jam this into every deck, which once again I'm fine with, but I can see the frustration, right, of every game must I have to worry about Op Agent. Same thing with like Drannith Magistrate. Once again, it never really hurts your deck, I'd say, or at least even if it's not the optimal choice in that slot, it's never too bad to hit this on turn 2 and shut off everybody's commander. I actually think this is a great card. I think that Commander is a better format when people aren't over-reliant on their commanders. I think that it forces more dynamic and inventive deck building than just here's my commander and here's the thing. So I actually wish everybody was playing Drannith Magistrate, personally. But I can see why it's irritating, because it's not really a build around, right? Like you just have a Drannith Magistrate, and now I can't do things. But once again, I'm supportive of all these types of cards. Lastly, we'll get into Notion Thief here. So Notion Thief does not make me salty. I will say this, though. Some of these cards, like, I just react to the table appropriately. So if you play a Notion Thief and I need to be drawing cards, or the Notion Thief is now in a position where you are drawing lots of cards because of your Notion Thief, you will become the number one threat at the table to me, just because you're getting so many cards. And it's funny, in every format outside of Commander, the players who are drawing the most cards, everyone kind of believes they're ahead, and they often are. In Commander, it's almost like, oh, you're 3 or 4 cards up. How much does that really matter? Well, it depends on the deck you're playing, but often it matters a lot. And so if somebody has a Notion Thief out, I'm usually pretty quick to target them for retaliation until the Notion Thief is dead. And if the Notion Thief dies and the board kind of stabilizes, they're not super far ahead, I usually let it go. It's not vindictive, truly. I'm never vindictive against the stacks. I just know that sometimes the only way to break the stacks is to kill the player. And so Notion Thief is a great example of, like, people slot into a lot of decks. It's a 50-cent card, so everyone can afford them. Or at least most everyone can afford them. And, you've kind of got to get off the table. And if you can't remove it, it's player removal is the best removal. Mill. So Mill's interesting, man. So I find Mill, like everyone else, a little bit irritating to play against, just because it's a little bit time consuming. But the element of being milled, it definitely induces a lot of salt at the table. Just watching your good cards go to the graveyard makes people really angry. And so you've got Maddening Cacophony here, which when kicked is a traumatize. You've got Psychic Corrosion. And so there's definitely Mesmeric Orb, which I actually love this card, but Mesmeric Orb definitely is salt-inducing. Mind Crank tends to combo out a lot and just mill so many cards. Point is, bringing all these things together, it's hard to accept when somebody traumatizes you, you're not actually losing cards in your hand. You're not losing playable resources. It's often card disadvantage for the mill player. And yet it's so frustrating. It's like, oh, I wanted to cast that card. Now it's in my graveyard. And so it's pretty interesting. I bet you if you were to go into a hobby shop, right, go to a card store, this is where you're going to play Commander. The more people, if like you could do a social experiment, like you, 20 people out of the 50 attendees are now going to play Mill for 2 months in a row. How many players would suddenly switch to Reanimator? It would be hilarious as people sort of metagame against their own shop. But yeah, don't really have much to say about Mill beyond that, except for if you're played Maddening, Cacophony, Mind Crank, Traumatize, I'm going to assume that there's some sort of combo with these things, which is fine. But Mind Crank, for example, just winds up comboing and killing the table with all sorts of things. And so it's always tough to tell if the mill player is milling you because they like to mill cards or milling you to combo. And so I've almost gotten to the point where I ask, like, is this like a combo mill thing, or is this just I want to mill and I'm going to try to mill the table? And if they say, well, kind of sort of, I say, what's the sort of part? Or is this like you'd rather not disclose and I'm just going to assess for myself if I should be beating your ass because I think your mill's going to turn into something other than irritation. Also, just for the record, I find Traumatized to be the most annoying thing in the world, only because I have to count the cards in my library. And yes, I know it's more efficient to count the cards in play and in your hand to do your rounding than count the entire library. I know that. It annoys me all the same. Every time I'm like, let me count these up. This is irritating. People are like, well, you could count this way. I'm like, I sure do know that. Still don't like it. Not a big deal, but admittedly, I think Traumatize is just a poorly designed card for that reason. That's a personal opinion, though. It doesn't cloud my judgment too much. I actually think Mill's kind of fun to play against, particularly to hear why they're playing Mill. So I got no beef with Mill. But know that if you're playing Mill, the table has beef with you. No one wants to play against Mill. No one. No one in the world. They're either okay with it or they hate it. Which is kind of an overarching theme here that I'm going to kind of, I think, bring together as we go through these cards I'm talking about as case examples. Everybody hates everything. It's so hard to build a deck that isn't offensive to somebody in your 4-card pod if you don't know people. 4-player pod if you don't know people. Everybody hates everything. Oh, Stax, well, probably 3 out of 4 players hate you. Only the Stax player doesn't hate themselves, or maybe they do. Mill, okay, I'm going to say at least 2, probably 3 still hate you at the table. And so you reach a point where you just have to play things that you perceive to be reasonable and just upset people sometimes. Okay, I'm actually going to go over here to mass removal. So mass removal sits on kind of a weird place where people hate mass removal when there's a lot of it because it just makes games drag on forever. And I've been there where you're like, oh, all the permanents have been removed like 5 or 6 times. But that's a game length issue. I don't think people tend to mind mass removal in general. There's definitely like a school of thought of, oh, it's so cheap, but it's really the only way to remove efficiency. My new gag, I've been using conversation with mass removal, and I think I have a point, but people look at me like I don't. When people play aristocrats, right? And you're playing aristocrats, and I'm going to grab a quick example. It didn't quite make my list yet, but I'm going to do Grave Pact in that white border I don't like. And then I'm going to quickly do a new tag here. And let's do aristocrats. I think I spelled that right. If I didn't, whatever. But tons of aristocrat cards. This is an archetype that gets a million bajillion cards printed for it. You can make it in 50,000 different ways. There's 1,000 different commanders that support it. Very easy starting point and very good. And it basically controls the whole table with cards like this typically, where when I sacrifice my thing, I get multiple benefits that are all very, very good. I find it really fascinating when somebody plays like an Aristocrats deck that has things like Grave Pact and the like, where they're going to be able to constantly remove all the permanents at the table by sacrificing their things and getting value. It isn't like widely panned right. Oh, well, that's what their deck does, which I agree with. I'm happy to play against Aristocrats, but if your deck has like 3 mass removal spells, that's toxic. That's toxic. You're resetting the board too much. We're going to be here forever. That's toxic. Which is fascinating. It's like it's okay to play your Aristocrats deck because it's on theme and it kills everything at the table repeatedly until you win, unless somebody destroys the engine. But the random, 1 or 2 card mass removal spells in the list that reset the table when a deck falls behind, which, depending on your strategy, you may fall behind a lot. That's toxic. That's not fair. That's not fun. I guess that my takeaway between this mass removal conversation versus things like aristocrats is it's like the gameplay pattern winds up being very similar in my experience. It's just there's some sort of like hypocrisy that if you build your deck around something, it's okay to do this thing that slows the game down to a snail's pace. But if you play them as one-offs, it's not okay. And if you slow the games down with stacks, you're a terrible human, and I hope your house burns down. Like, it starts to feel like assumed more than it's experienced through play patterns. Like, the number of people I talk to that hate stacks who've never actually played against a stacks deck is actually really high. And so it's intriguing to me. I don't think it's based on reality. Okay, but let's keep going here. So if you play lots of mass removal, once again, truly I'm fine with it, but this is going to irritate people. Land destruction. People hate land destruction. So you've got targeted land destruction like wasteland and strip mine, which will irritate the person whose land you explode, but broadly I don't think it's going to be too bad. But if you start having like Crucible of Worlds in here or something else that, Life from the Low, if you start picking up these lands and blowing up people's lands repeatedly, you're going to make enemies fast. And I actually think that's pretty reasonable in that if you are recurring strip mines and wastelands, eventually the table's not going to have resources to play Magic the Gathering, and so their only option is to shut down the engine or shut you down with player removal. And so I think when you have an engine based around land destruction, you being the number one target of the table is often correct, right? Like, I don't see a problem with that. And I don't think there's anything worthy of discussion beyond that. Same thing with like Mana Vortex. This is an oldie but a goodie. And if you've got like a Mana Vortex combo set up, obviously you're going to be unpopular. What I don't really enjoy is the fact that if you're playing Armageddon or Ravages of War in your deck, people talk to you like you're some sort of like psychopath, like you're an animal. And it's interesting because so many strategies in Commander right now rely on, at least the casual tables that I sit at, getting 10 million treasures or 10,000 lands and casting some big bombastic thing. And I want to see the fireworks and do my crazy thing. And hopefully my crazy thing's better than your crazy thing. And these cards obviously really punish that type of approach. And I think it's great. I do think playing random Ravages of War and Armageddons in your deck with no way to win, I'm just playing mass land removal to play last land removal, is a little bit bad-mannered, and I think that I'd probably ask you why that's in the deck, particularly if you don't have good follow-ups. But if you actually have a strategy to win around mass land destruction, I think it's a wonderful strategy, and I absolutely think you should play your mass removal, your mass land removal decks, provided it's part of some sort of theme and strategy and not just some sort of, let's just see if I can get the table to to accept that I don't want anybody to play Magic, which someone's going to point out, somebody's going to be clever and point out, but that's what Stax does. I'm like, well, once again, Stax requires some level of assembly, and there's a strategy around it for the most part, particularly if it's a true Stax deck. Jamming Ravages of War and Armageddon into your deck with no actual strategy is pointless. Like, I used to know a guy, and I think everyone used to know this guy. For me, this guy was in Virginia. I used to live in Virginia in the United States here. Give this the perfect tag, crazy. So my man used to play Obliterate in a bunch of decks because it's affordable, and since everyone's playing Go Tall Commander, there's a very high probability we'll get to 8 mana, and then most people probably don't have something that can stop something uncounterable, and you get obliterated and everything's basically blown out unless there's like a Super Friends Planeswalker player, and you're just in for a bad time. There was no strategy behind this Obliterate except to obliterate the board. That is the type of deck design that I find, I guess, curious. I never stopped playing with the guy, but there was some part of me that sort of got to the point where I'm like, why are we playing Obliterate in all our decks? Like, this is so warping. But Mass Land Destruction, I think this one sits in this weird area where it can be difficult to say, is this actually unfun? I still say for the most part no, because I would argue anytime you're jamming cards into your deck just to screw up other players without a plan to actually win from it is just bad deck design. It's not sensible. But once again, it's more of a deck construction issue than it's an issue of just playing a Ravages to War. If we just play Ravages to War with no strategy, that bad. If we have a strategy around Ravages to War, that great. Okay, let's keep going. So Child of Alar is a card I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about when I talk about this. Like, Aristocrats, completely A-okay. Child of Alara, I hate you now and forever. So one thing about Aristocrats is it tends to mostly remove creatures. It can sometimes have engines to remove other things, but usually it's blowing out all the creatures or drawing the Aristocrats player cards. Child of Alara blows out all permanents and all permanents types except for, well, except for lands, basically, or indestructible things, exceptions, of course. It's so funny to me. Like, if you sit down at most tables, I'd say are largely creature based. And so if you're playing at a creature based casual table and you sit down with your Child of Alar and they see that in your command zone, you might have a hard time getting the table to play with you beyond a single game. They might not play with you at all. But if the player sits down with their random aristocrats commander and is going to lock out the table with a bunch of aristocrat combos, well, that's completely fine. That really bothers me. Now, that said, I do think Child of Alara leads to bad gameplay patterns because Child of Alara distinctly punishes decks that build lots of permanents, which tends to be the typical commander deck these days. But if you sit down with a Spell Slinger at the table, or a deck that can play mostly out of the hand, doesn't need a lot of expensive permanents and play at one time, suddenly this card becomes actually awful, and your 5-color Wrath deck is probably almost unplayable, and you're just going to hand the game to somebody else. So some of these cards are polarizing, which is difficult because I think if somebody wants to make a Child of Alara deck, they should be able to. And they should be able to find people that'll play with them without salt. But it's weird because you're playing this board game version of Magic, right? We've got like a 4-player thing where we're all gathering resources and we're often making political deals and making trades with one another. And it can be difficult to make decks that aren't favoring certain people at the table in one way or another. So I see both sides on this one. That's why I like to talk about Child of Alara. I think it's a card where the person who wants to make Child of Alara has a completely defensible, reasonable case, and the people that don't want to play against Child of Alara have a completely defensible, reasonable case, which I think is a strong contrast to Stax, where most well-built Stax decks are set up in a way that it will lock out all of the table or lock out the thing that they're weak to specifically, as opposed to just being kind of a general intentional blind spot like with the Child of Alara. Okay, next I want to talk about the cards that people tend to just despise you playing just because they're busted, just because they're so overplayed. It's overdone. They see it every game. It does well every game. It's in every deck, either as a proxy or a real copy. And I want to read, there's nothing wrong with playing these cards, but I do think that I give you a little bit of a, if I rate my salt meter on like the 0 to 6, if you play any of these cards, I will probably, all things being equal, consider you the threat at the table most of the time. Of this list I have here, I think Esper Sentinel is by far the least offensive. So it's a little mini Ristic study, right? I'm a big believer of pay the 1. I know most people don't pay the 1. I think the best way to make cards like this not outrageously good is just pay the 1 and accept you're going to be playing a little bit slower, particularly if these types of tax cards are played in non-competitive lists where you can afford to wait. They're probably not going to blow out the table super quick. If everybody just greeds all their instants and sorceries, then this guy's going to get, like a concentrate. But if people play a little less greedy and pay the 1 for a while, this winds up being like a bad card draw spell. So, while I think Esper Sentinel really irritates people, I actually think Esper Sentinel is completely fine. I think this card is more than fair, and I used to get really salty with this, and I think I've let my salt go. Ristic Study is annoying. Ristic Study is poorly designed, common from Prophecy, costs a lot of money for something with this many reprints, of course. And it tends to be people jam it into every single blue deck, so people get tired of seeing it, right? Because in a multiplayer format, this is bound to get you too many cards or too much tempo for what you invested to get it. It fits in everything, and it goes in pretty much everything blue that's optimized. And it just gets tiresome. It's not particularly fun to play against in a lot of ways. I'll pay the 1. I won't pay the 1. Every time you play this play, you have to prompt them. Are you going to pay the 1? Once again, I don't think people should ever feel guilty for playing the cards that they do, but Ristic Study is irritating, and I tend to prioritize taking it off the table for my own sanity, and I think other players do too. And so I think the only way to police a card like Ristic Study is either A, everybody's playing it, or everybody who can play it is playing it, or B, you're going to play a Ristic Study and people are going to accept you have too many cards and you're going to get targeted down. I really do feel like the issue with this card is it's in an easy color combination of just one blue pip, 3 mana, and it goes in everything. It's as powerful as it is homogenous, and it's tiresome. So if you play Ristic Study, that's great. I admittedly play Ristic Study in a couple of my decks too. We want our cards to be good. We want our decks to be good, but man, this card. I would not mind if this card got banned out of Commander. It never will be, and I don't think from a power level perspective, Ristic Study needs to be banned, but I hate it. I actually do hate it, and sometimes I feel like I have to be part of the problem to play against the problem. Shieldred. So one thing, this being $83 and not a reserve list card is hilarious to me. I hope they reprint this into the earth. I hope that every card that's this expensive that isn't on the reserve list gets reprinted to oblivion. That said, 4/5 for 4, Death Touch, Keyword Soup. Whenever you draw a card, you gain life. Whenever they lose a card, draw 2 life. You're kind of doing everything that annoys people at the table. They're getting punished for playing the game. You're getting rewarded for playing the game. It tends to combo out and kill people with a lot of different things. So it's a combo piece that's generally good in every circumstance. This card is almost never bad. In fact, it may actually never be bad. And so anytime somebody plays this, I bump them up on my must-kill list at the table. Once again, if you've got them, smoke them if you got them. I think Shieldred's a fun card for the controller. I think Shieldred's pretty neat. I actually love the art, but it's hard to see someone play a Shieldred at the table and not to feel a certain type of way about it, like this player needs to die. And I think which, once again, differentiates this from a lot of other like must-kill type cards or must-kill player who plays this card is that it just goes in everything with no opportunity cost. I don't have to put anything else in my deck to make this reasonable. Okay with it being in the game, okay with it being printed, but certainly deserves kind of a lot of the ire it gets because people are just sick of seeing it. And I'm clearly tired of seeing it. Smothering Tithe. So Smothering Tide, I think people vastly underestimate how powerful this card is. The pay 2 basically means until it's ultra late game, nobody's going to be paying the 2. And this card is wild. Smothering Tithe, super powerful, can easily fit into pretty much every deck. And so people get sick of playing against Smothering Tide, understandably. And it kind of falls into that same trap as Ristic Study. I don't think Smothering Tithe is as good as Ristic Study, but I think it's in that same pitfall of like, it's irritating in multiplayer and not really a big deal in 60-card formats, which is why you run into this weird, like, balancing around Commander is kind of messy. Then you've got the One Ring. Yay! So, the One Ring is an artifact, which I think is a terrible design mistake. Not a mistake at all from a lore perspective. I think for a lore perspective, this card is spot on. I think this is super fun if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, which every Lord of the Rings card from the Lord of the Rings set gets all the Lord of the Rings fans jumping up and down. And that's great. I think it's probably the best Universes Beyond they've ever done and probably ever will do, both from a financial perspective and from a how people feel about it perspective. But this card irritates me. This card, of course, warped every format it was in, and I think it continues to warp Commander. The protection for a full turn is surprisingly relevant, particularly because once you play this card, you tend to be unpopular at a lot of tables. And the One Ring being indestructible, while a flavor win, is completely outrageous from a balancing perspective. And so this card winds up drawing the owner lots of cards in any deck it's in. Being an artifact, it's relatively easy to tutor for in most colors, one way or another. Because blue, white can easily tutor for it. Black can tutor for anything. Green, slightly harder time, but red, well, red doesn't get to tutor at all. Can I just do and gamble? But either way, this card can be put in any color, and it's just so good in any deck it's in. And I don't know, I think if you're trying to make optimal lists, you're going to be at the point where you're going to buy like 600 proxied copies of this because it just goes in everything. I hate this card, and I actually don't run most of my copies. I have 4 copies of the One Ring, I think 5 actually, and I run 1 copy of it. And I feel bad that I do. It's into ready, so the deck is completely trashed and not updated, but has a One Ring, so I guess there's that. I will say it's really interesting the number of players who rage out against Ristic Study, myself included to a point. Like, once again, I always try to keep it in check, but Ristic Study is not a card I enjoy playing against, but nobody gets as upset about the One Ring, and I think in a lot of games I play, I've been trying to track how many cards they draw off a Ristic versus the One Ring, and the One Ring will sometimes draw a comparable number of cards, and it would have fit into more decks easier. So I don't know. This is actually easier to remove as well, and you can actually pay the 1. So I don't know, man. The One Ring, I think it should get more table hate than it does. I will say though, the fact that they get protection for a turn makes them hard to hate out. Lastly, you've got some combo cards here that I see all the time. Of course, you've got Thassa's Oracle, the de facto CDH deck. I don't really think you can run a Thoracle combo without being a CDH deck. So I think this is one of those weird moments where, like, you want to play Thassa's Oracle and like Tainted Pact or something like that. Demonic Consult, Thassa's Oracle. I think that you just need to go full CDH. Like, I don't think there's a world where you can get away with playing a combo like that and the table not treating you like a CDH player. Even if your deck's a little bit slower, and even if there's a justifiable case that it isn't as crazy as it could be, I don't know, man. Just the guttural reaction that people feel to this card and how hard it is to actually interact with a combo is kind of feels bad. So Thoracle takes you into a different plane of existence. Underworld Breach, I think it's kind of similar, like Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond stuff, Underworld Breach and Lotus Petal stuff. I think those combos are very good. I think these can at least be interacted with good removal. Not necessarily easily, but I don't have as much of a problem with Underworld Breach, but it's certainly one of those crazy combo cards that's always going to get you a little bit of attention. Now, so this is my favorite piece here. So you've got this Bloodthirsty Conqueror. Whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. There's also like Sanguine Blood. Let's see if I got that right. There it is. It's Bond, not Blood. So you've got like those types of pieces there where you've got gain life and lose life combos. Move this over here to combo. And I'm oddly blanking on the other one's name, but shouldn't be hard to find. It's kind of it's been even sold together in a secret layer. Sanguine Blonde, Exquisite Blood. Cool name. There it is. And let's go ahead and add that to the main deck. So I've got my little YouTube list here put together. And so you've got these as well. And these combo out all on their own. Whenever you gain life, target loses that much. Whenever your opponent loses life, you gain that much life. Woo, it loops and kills the table. And Bloodthirsty Conquerors on a 5/5 body flying Death Touch for 5. Yay! And a vampire. Very good combo, obviously. And it's weird to me that as good as this combo is, you don't seem to get a lot of frustration from the table when you're playing it. Not in the same way you do with Thassa's Oracle. So I think there's some sort of weird, inconsistent logic about how we analyze cards. All right. So we've gotten through my list. It's starting to get a little bit long here. So I want to try to wrap up in under an hour. I'm going to pick up my pace. So as I've talked about, most cards don't bother me. I do think I tend to be more on the relaxed side. I'm kind of a low energy person in a lot of ways. But there are some cards that even if I don't express it out loud, if somebody were to ask me if they annoy me or they make me salty, 100%. Ad nauseum makes me crazy. And so here is my frustration with ad nauseum. When the player is playing ad nauseum, for this card to really get a lot of value in a reasonably well-designed deck list, your cost is going to be low to the ground, which means the speed of the deck is going to be low to the ground, which means ad nauseum forces a deck to be more brutally efficient, which I'm all about brutal efficiency, but you're getting pushed towards this, like, at any given time, you become the threat. At any given time, I should be attacking you, because the only way to make this card not positively bananas is a Stax piece, or I need to lower your life total so you can't get as much crazy value out of it. And so that is why I don't love when people put this in their deck. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. But I also think that it's kind of like playing a random Necropotence in your deck where it's just totally bananas in what it does. And so this doesn't even let me attack other players a lot of the time. Like, I feel like most of the time I know somebody has ad nauseum in their list, I have to be attacking them, even though I'd rather attack, another player who I think is also building a presentable board state. I also haven't seen a lot of ad naus for value. Ad naus is almost always in some sort of combo pile. So once again, smoke them if you got them. It makes me mad because it forces me to play in a certain type of way. And there's really no opportunity cost in your deck except make it better. Like the ad nauseam requirement to make ad nauseam good is play black and make the deck better. Make it cost low to the ground, make all the cards more efficient, then ad nauseam is good. The deck building restriction, of course, is you can't play big bomby stuff, which is a bit a letdown. So that's its own deck restriction. I don't actually see ad nauseam very often, and so when I do it, despite my initial misgivings about it, it does create an interesting type of deck list. It's not as go tall; they're usually more efficient. But man, the lots of tutors into ad nause type lists kind of just forces a lot of attacks that player's way, and while that's completely fine, it does make me hate my life a little bit. Okay, Font of Mythos. So this card I don't think is any way overpowered. I think this card is completely reasonable, and it makes me crazy. I hate playing against Font of Mythos. I'd rather play against a Ristic Study, a Shieldred, the One Ring. I'd rather play against a CDH list than probably a Font of Mythos. The whole like, oh, it's so fun, everybody gets lots of cards, is not fun for me. A big part of what I enjoy, and this is just a me thing, right, is I enjoy this kind of like grindy, keeping track of how much value multiple players have accumulated, trying to make sure nobody gets too far ahead on cards, trying to make sure I have enough answers, I can appropriately react, I can assume they don't have enough reaction to stop me. Font of Mythos completely batters my internal tracking because everyone's getting so many cards. So lists where the fundamental weakness of their own deck list is it has a hard time drawing cards, but the card quality and what it does is very good otherwise. If somebody who isn't that player plays a Font of Mythos, the only axis their deck was weak has now been completely eliminated for them. And a lot of the time, the Font of Mythos decks, like, they get more value from it overall than the rest of the table, but at the same time, like, people I see play Howling Mine and Font of Mythos lose the game. So I feel like they just jack up the entire, like, internal balance of the table, and they themselves often don't win. It's like kind of that weird group huggy, king making, even though you don't mean to. I don't know. I hate it. I hate Font of Mythos. Ristic Studies all day. Ad nauseum all day. I hate Font of Mythos. Which dovetails directly into Miss Bumbleflower. So Miss Bumbleflower, I think, is actually an interesting design, and I think the concept is pretty cool. That said, it suffers from the same problem of Font of Mythos, where I feel like it really screws up the equilibrium of the table. And I often find that person playing Miss Bumbleflower, and I don't play Miss Bumbleflower, but I feel like a lot of the people who are playing Miss Bumbleflower have this kind of like group huggy element where obviously they're getting more cards than anybody else, but they often don't do a great job of determining who the threat is, right? Like, who should I not give or not give cards to? And there's a lot of like, I'll give that card to that player because I like them, right? They're my friend. We came here together. And this is probably not inherently a problem with Miss Bumbleflower. This is just part of playing Commander. It's part of Magic. But I hate my life. I hate Miss Bumbleflower. I hate the play patterns it leads to. I do not want to play against Miss Bumbleflower. I have never complained, and I never will, because I think it's completely reasonable to play, but I hate my life. I hate Miss Bumbleflower so much. So Temple of Discovery. I think this is a neat card, actually. I think the thing that I don't like about Temple of Discovery is I think in 90 to 95% of cases, this is 4 mana, search your library for a land, and put it into play. If the table knows what they're doing, they should almost never search. Never search. So anytime multiple players start searching off this, I mean, they get these lands untapped. And so you wind up in these crazy, like, 4 mana, get 3 untapped lands of any type. And I just think it's a poorly designed card because it relies on the table not understanding that everyone needs to decline. And so I don't love it. Please, no more Temple of Discovery. I used to play it in a list, too, and then the first time I played it, I got quad search off it, and I just killed everybody with Valakut. It was fun for me at the time, but I knew it would never happen again. And so that's kind of the thing, right? It relies on people not understanding that you should never take the offer. I think it's actually a worse designed version of Expropriate, because with Expropriate, every option is a terrible option, but it's 9 mana. It's meant to end the game. This just lets somebody snowball out of control if they don't understand the mechanics of it, or just don't care. Because that's the other thing. It's not like some of this is, oh my gosh, super mega mind magic over here. It's not that. It's that people just don't care. They'd rather just give the search for the memes, which I really don't like when people start kind of disrupting the flow of the game for the memes. I think it's time to take a break. Toski. I actually love Toski in a single player game, like on a 1v1. I love Toski when everybody's playing Magic in a serious manner. When people are just goofing around, like a table that's dicking around with Toski makes me crazy. Like, I cannot begin to tell you the number of times someone will have a Toski and play in, like, I don't know, 4 tokens, a couple creatures. They don't have good attacks, right? They can attack and lose some guys and draw some cards, which should probably be fine for them. And they look around the table and say, hey, does anyone just want to let me hit you so I can get free cards? I just want free cards, guys. And for whatever reason, like, the social engineering works. People are like, oh, yeah, you can hit me and get some free cards. I don't mind. That's crazy. You're giving people, especially like, it's not like you're trying to feed cards to somebody so they can find an answer for somebody else. You're just giving them the free cards to be like a nice guy. Like, if you want to be a nice guy, take them out to dinner. I don't know. I don't understand it. I don't understand why Toski convinces people to just give free card draws. The willingness of players in Commander to give other players free cards for absolutely no benefit to themselves is daunting to me. Absolutely daunting. This card, it does not make sense to me. No Toski. Too bad this can't be counted as indestructible. So if someone wants to play Toski, I pretty much have to live with it. I can't even be the solution to the problem. I mean, I can try to convince people not to do that, but once again, there's a lot of social politicking around Toski where I just think that it baffles my mind, the decisions and deals people make. All right, that brings me to the end of the cards I want to talk about aside from price memory cards. So these are cards I bring up because I think these are cards that disproportionately cause people to freak out. I want to point out all 5 of these cards on this list in varying degrees are very good cards. Like, I'm not saying that they should be ignored, they should be taken seriously, but I think that people kind of lose track of time and they're playing like in 2016 again when these cards used to be like the big bads of the format of Commander, and they've just never forgotten. So Zur is pretty scary because Zur usually assembles some sort of combo engine, but I think on the 4 mana slot there are a lot of commanders like Urza, for example, that will also Urza High Lord Artificer, excuse me, that are actually competitive and actually really good. Give me a sec here. Yeah, do it like this. I'm going to scale this list up with time. Whereas I think in a lot of cases, Zur on 4 is actually worse than Urza on 4. Like, sure, this will probably get a combo that will end the game, but this will probably make infinite mana almost the moment it's played, and it's almost never bad. And so, I don't know, man. I genuinely believe that this card is still overhyped at the modern table. So Aloro, Ageless Ascetic. So it generates a ton of HP. It's in good colors. It's decent value for 6, but it ultimately becomes its own engine, right, of card draw and draining gain at the table. And, you get your own baby Phyrexian Arena, your own baby Sheoldred. So it's obviously very good, but man, when people see this, it's like, must be killed on sight type of thing. And to me, it's just a really strong, grindy commander on the 6 mana mark that gets a lot of life. I know there's great combos with this. I know there's all sorts of things it can do that are very good, but I still think people strongly overreact to this card. Dude, Edgar Markov. Okay, so of course this is the big vampire baddie. Everyone's always trying to open them from the new Innistrad Remastered. Don't open Innistrad Remastered, just buy singles. And I think this is an awesome card. Now, Imminence, of course, is a busted mechanic. Imminence is crazy on every commander that has Imminence. I don't think it's a well-designed mechanic. There's a reason it's never been brought back. But the problems of Imminence aside, I in no way think this card is overpowered or crazy. I think that this is a very strong vampire commander for your vampire tribal or your value aristocrats deck, or both. It's probably both in the same theme. But either way, I think that people see Edgar Markov and they assume this is like a power level 10 million deck and we either can't play with them or they have to be killed immediately. I really don't think that's the case. I think on 6 mana, it's really not that scary. And I think the fact that it's not in blue automatically blue or green kind of limits it in a more casual setting. This card is fine, and I don't mind people playing Edgar Markov at all. I actually get more annoyed when it's once again in this Aristocrats engine, but it's the engine that's bothering me, not Edgar Markov. Derevi. So Derevi, I actually love this new art for Derevi, but I think that Derevi plays really well into a lot of like controlling Staxy lists, but once again, I think we've reached the point where there are a lot of ways to break state parity on stasis. There's a lot of ways to untap your permanents, and I think sending your whole commander slot for this is probably not worth it. And so while I think the Derevi is great and a great Bant commander build around, I think that this premise that Derevi is like a CEDH kill on sight level of commander that a lot of people still kind of verbally tell me is just crazy. Like the card is good, but it is not in any way the scary piece it used to be in the like it was in once in like 2016, like the early years. And then last but not least, Atraxa. So Atraxa is an interesting place because I do think people are sick of seeing this. It's been the number one most popular commander on EDH Rec for a million years, which I do think those stats are kind of misleading because this was also in a pre-con, and it's been in a couple of like lots and lots of printings. So I don't necessarily know if it is as popular or frequently played. Like I bet there's a ton of like Atraxa lists that are made and then never played again, right? Like they only exist on paper. So I've got some reliability in the stats issues. I can't prove it, but I honestly feel like the popularity of Atraxa is overrated. I also feel like on 4 mana, this card is nothing special. I think that it's kind of a, you can jam it in anything and build any theme you want around it, but it itself doesn't do anything exciting. Like I think that Flying Vigilance, Death Touch, and Like Link are great keyword salad that lets you attack for 4 every turn and shut down attackers. I also feel Shieldred is almost the same thing in a lot of instances. Neither has first strike. Shieldred has more toughness. They both have death touch. Atraxa, of course, has vigilance, but I don't think the proliferability outside of planeswalkers is really that good. And even when you are putting them on planeswalkers, it honestly winds up putting a lot less counters on than just like one resolve doubling season does in a lot of games in practice. So I don't know. I think the hype around Atraxa is way overrated. I don't think this is... I think it's a good commander, and I think it's always going to be a good, efficient card, but I think the amount of freak-out energy you find from tables when somebody's playing Atraxa is really interesting. You know, speaking personally, I once sat down with a true Atraxa Precon, which has some good cards in it, but it's also completely janky, and the mana's screwed up, and it has a lot of cards that don't really do anything because they're designed for the backup commanders. I don't know, standard old-school Precon problems. And I don't know, people still freaked out because it's the Atraxa Precon. All right, I've got about 2 minutes left, and so I want to go through my last thing here on my Microsoft Word document, quotes that make me crazy. Read the card in a condescending voice. Reading the card is always good advice, and I think anytime somebody hands you a card and says, it's easier to read it, no problem. It's not always your responsibility to explain your cards to everybody at the table. That said, in a commander game, particularly one that's dragging on, there's probably 5 to 8 permanents at everybody's station, and they're trying to keep track of their own stuff and how it interacts with lots and lots of rules of texts. And so somebody asking you to explain how your card works and you saying read the card, or reading the card explains the card in some kind of like, I'm a big deal and I'm really good at Magic is outrageous. A lot of times people that say read the card often wind up having to Google rules later on like everybody else. So it's one thing asking people to pay attention and encourage them to read your cards. It's another to talk down to them like you're like big brain or something. I don't know. It doesn't come up a lot, but there is like this underpinning of like, well, you just need to read the card. Like, no, dude. Like, come on now. All right, some other things. You killed me last game, and so my anger management skills suck, and I'm still mad, and I decided to sleep up and play anyway. So now this entire game, my sole goal in life is to kill you, even if you're not the big threat or even the most powerful deck at the table. This leads to bad games. This leads to bad commander. This leads to you need to take a breather. Please don't do this. Please do not hold the salt game after game. You destroyed my crazy powerful thing. This is one of my least favorite tropes in Commander. Somebody plays like a game-ending commander or a commander that generates tons of advantage, or it's just super, super good, like a kill-on-sight commander, and then you blow it up, or you counterspell it, or you otherwise engage with it, and they're really salty. outrageous. Obviously, no one's supposed to be thrilled when their stuff gets countered or destroyed, but the whole like, I don't know, upset with the player who destroyed it is silly. That's childish. Like, if you don't want your stuff to get targeted, play less powerful stuff. This is an upgraded precon. So this is one of my favorite expressions. It's so funny because people buy precon, which is great, and great new precons. And then they'll be like, "Oh, what's the power level of your deck?" Oh, it's not a big deal. It's an upgraded precon, and they've got like basically only the good cards left in the precon, and they've swapped out all the jank for good or really good cards. And so at this point, it's not really an upgraded precon. You're basically just playing a Valgavoth deck. The number of people that say it's an upgraded precon is Valgavoth, and they basically just added all the good group slug cards and made it really good, but it's still an upgraded precon. What does it even mean? You're playing Valgavoth. Like, your upgraded precon is, at this point, would trounce pretty much any other precon. The only thing about it that's precon-like is the fact it originally came out of a precon box. I guess I've reached a point where I don't understand what upgraded precon is even supposed to mean anymore, other than I originally bought it in a precon. Maybe somebody else can walk it out for me in the comments, but I don't get it, man. And the last one is, like, you're in a complicated board state, you're trying to come up with blocks, and you're like, okay, so if I block with these mechanics, like with onboard information, is that enough damage? Like, how, if that's an 8/8 and I assign 8 damage to it, with the current board state as we see it, barring any interaction out of your hand, should that kill it? I don't know, man. Maybe you should figure out the board state and read the cards. Like, okay, fair, but how badly do you want to win that you just can't answer the man's question or the person's question, right? It's always interesting to me, especially as games drag on, how the investment goes up and like the frustration goes up. And like previously, if you'd ask, like, you think I should block that maybe? Like, what do you think? Like, they just answer you candidly, like, probably a good blocker. It's a more social, right? It's social until it's not. And that's something about the quote-unquote casual commander side of Commander that is where I play that I find kind of irritating is the random energy switch from this is all in good fun, maybe you should block, I think you should block, to, ooh, I might actually want to win here, so now suddenly I'm not going to answer your questions in good faith. Or, well, I just need you to read every card on this table and make your own decisions because now we're playing competitive Magic. All of that was fine if it was consistent, but it's never consistent. It's never consistent. And it's the inconsistency driven by the emotional ups and downs and throughout a Magic game that just really irritates me because you don't have to deal with this in 60-card Magic. In 60-card Magic, no one is ever going to tell you how to play. They're only going to tell you what the card does. But suddenly in Commander, it goes from, this is casual for funsies, to this is very serious, and I need you to figure out the board state. And I don't know, like, pick a lane. Like, you're here to have fun, or you're here to pilot your deck as best you're able, and there's going to be no takesy backsies. Because that's the other thing that's amazing is, like, I'm not going to explain how it works to you, I'm not going to help you identify this board state, is often followed up by, like, oh, I tapped my mana wrong, I played the wrong land, I missed a trigger, all these things. So suddenly, like, the pro gamer, super competitive Starker Brood War guy here is like, never mind. Now it's casual again. I just don't like the inconsistency. I really, really don't. And I think this is probably like a controversial take because it's not your job to explain to somebody else how the deck works. But I do think if somebody asks you a reasonable question about, is there, this is currently an 8/8. Am I missing any onboard effects here, or should 8 damage kill it, or should 4 damage kill it, or, is there any special effects on this block that I'm not seeing? Because if you don't want to answer questions like that, you're going to have to accept that the person's going to sit there and read through every single card of the table meticulously to get it right, when you could just tell them. Obviously, this is not an appeal to reveal your onboard tricks and your tricks in your hand. Like, oh, that's different. That's not known information. But if it's known information, I think it's reasonable to help players along in a multiplayer casual game. So, just over an hour. I never stick to time. Apologies. But I had a good time with this, and I hope the small audience that views it enjoys my thoughts as well. I do hope those of you that watch it will opt to kind of comment, because these topics are more fun if multiple people engage. And I'll end with this. Having now read the EDH communities on Reddit, Commander communities, I've decided that if you are playing any deck that isn't a pile of flaming garbage, everyone hates your deck. So don't worry about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see everyone next time.